Welcome back to HDO Photo. Today's episode covers the 3 camera settings you must learn. We'll begin with shutter speed. The shutter controls how long a camera's sensor is struck by light. It does this by opening and closing for a limited amount of time. The amount of time that the shutter opens is called the shutter speed. Fast shutter speeds begin around 1/500th of a second. At these speeds, the shutter is only open for a short amount of time, allowing it to freeze action. Fast shutter speeds allow less light inside the camera, producing darker images. 1/30th of a second is the slowest shutter speed where a camera can still be handheld without blur. Slow shutter speeds are longer than 1/30th of a second, for example, 1/15th of a second. At these speeds, the shutter is open for a longer amount of time, allowing it to blur action. Slow shutter speeds allow more light inside the camera, producing brighter images. When shooting slower than 1/30th of a second, use a tripod and remote control to avoid getting blurry images. Long exposures begin around 1 second. At these speeds, the shutter is open for very long periods of time, blurring all motion. Long exposures are used for night photography, lightning, smooth water, fireworks, light painting, infrared and full spectrum photography. We've introduced the shutter and what it does. Let's discuss how to control it. We'll focus on manual mode. With many cameras, you switch to manual mode by turning the mode dial to M. In manual mode, shutter speed is controlled by the shutter dial. It's generally located on top of the camera, in front, or on the back. With the camera switched on, press the shutter button down halfway. This activates the light meter. Now turn the shutter dial. You will see the shutter speed change in one or more of the following places: the back panel, the secondary display, and because we activated the light meter, inside the viewfinder as well. Turn the shutter dial to the left. In my case, turning left selects longer, slower shutter speeds. Turn the shutter dial to the right. In my case, turning right selects faster, shorter shutter speeds. I'll set the shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second. Notice that the back panel lists this as a fraction. The viewfinder and secondary display list it as a whole number instead, because they're not able to show fractions. My Canon and Nikon cameras list shutter speeds the same way, until I get to 3/10ths of a second. My Canons list 3/10ths of a second as 0.3. My Nikon displays it as 1/3 on its back panel, and as 3 inside its viewfinder. Here's another example at 6/10ths of a second. My Canons list this as 0.6. My Nikon displays it as 1/1.6 on its back panel, and as 1.6 in its viewfinder. Turning further left brings us to 1 second. Canon and Nikon display long exposures as a number followed by a quotation mark. For example, 1 second is a 1 followed by a quotation mark. Let's discuss the setting named bulb. Bulb lets us capture very long exposures, like this 15-minute night scene. Depending on your camera, bulb may be found after 30 seconds in manual mode, or on the mode dial as a separate mode. It's often labeled B for bulb. When using bulb, the shutter stays open as long as the shutter button is held down. Use a tripod and remote control to avoid shaking the camera. Some cameras display exposure time on the back panel when shooting in bulb. Other cameras list this information on the secondary display. The aperture is an opening inside your lens. It controls how much light enters the camera. By opening wider, the aperture permits more light inside. By closing down, the aperture permits less light inside. The aperture is measured in f-stops. Low numbers, like f1.8, are wide. High numbers, like f22, are narrow. Wide apertures, like f1.8, create brighter images. Narrow apertures, like f22, create darker images. The aperture also controls how much of an image is in focus, which is known as depth of field. Wide apertures, like f2.8, create a shallow depth of field, blurring more of the image. Narrow apertures, like f22, create a deeper depth of field, focusing more of the image. Let's discuss how to control your camera's aperture. Like before, we'll concentrate on manual mode. With some cameras, you control the aperture by holding a button while turning the shutter dial. It's usually the exposure compensation button, which is labeled with plus and minus signs. On Canons, the button is also labeled AV, while Nikons have an aperture symbol next to it. To change the aperture, push and hold the button while turning the shutter dial. Other cameras may have a dedicated aperture dial. To change the aperture, turn the dial. Depending on the camera, you should be able to see the setting change in one or more of the following places: the back panel, inside the viewfinder, or the secondary LCD. We know what the aperture is and how to control it. Now we can discuss how the aperture is used. We can think of aperture in terms of light. Use wide apertures in low light to avoid underexposing an image. Use narrow apertures in bright light to avoid overexposing an image. We can also think of aperture in terms of shutter speed. Use wide apertures to enable fast shutter speeds and freeze action. Use narrow apertures to enable slow shutter speeds and blur action. We can also use aperture in terms of distance. Use wide apertures for nearby subjects. Use narrow apertures for distant subjects. A camera's sensor absorbs light to create digital images. ISO describes how sensitive a camera's sensor is to light. A low ISO, like 100, makes the sensor less sensitive to light. This produces a darker image. A high ISO, like 6400, makes the sensor more sensitive to light. This produces a brighter image. In this case, ISO 800 with a shutter speed of 1/1600th of a second at f1.8 created a good exposure. A good exposure is balanced, not too bright and not too dark. The ISO also controls the amount of noise in an image. Noise generally resembles a grainy pattern or colorful splotches. Low ISOs, like 100, produce very little noise. High ISOs, like 25,000 and beyond, produce a large amount of noise. Let's discuss how to adjust your camera's ISO. This applies to user-controlled modes, like manual, shutter priority, aperture priority, and program. Your camera may have a dedicated ISO button. Typically, pressing the button allows you to change the ISO in one of the following ways: a menu on the back panel, the secondary black and white LCD, or inside the viewfinder. Other cameras use a quick setting button, like this Nikon D3000. In this case, it's labeled I. The button opens a quick setting menu. This lets you open an ISO submenu from where you can change the setting. Higher ISOs are often labeled H or high, followed by a number if multiple options are available. Let's discuss how ISO settings are used. A low ISO, like 100, can be used in bright light to avoid overexposing an image. A high ISO, like 25,000 or higher, can be used in low light to avoid underexposing an image. For a cleaner look, use a lower ISO to produce less noise. For a grittier look, use a high ISO to produce more noise. Low ISOs can help reduce noise during long exposures, like in this 11-second light painting captured at ISO 100. Notice how much noisier this 1.7-second exposure is at ISO 32,000. Low ISOs help enable slow shutter speeds to blur action. High ISOs help enable fast shutter speeds to freeze action. Practice with these settings by photographing a prop. Work in manual mode and see how changing each setting affects the resulting image. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in learning more, please like, share, and subscribe.